Thank you all for coming. This is the end of October, almost, 2013. The attack on our consulate in Benghazi on September the 11th, and eventually the annex that resulted in 4 dead Americans. Almost 14 months later, we haven't been able to talk to the people who survived the attack. And we're supposed to tell the American people, here's what happened in Benghazi, and the administration will not allow the Congress to have independent access to those who survived the attack. And I don't know how our country can function in the future if that becomes the norm. Within 48 hours of the attack, survivors were taken to Germany to be interviewed by the FBI. Those survivors were interviewed by the FBI, and the FBI is refusing to share the results of those interviews, the actual interviews themselves, with the Congress, arguing this is an ongoing criminal investigation. Just think what that would mean for the future of this nation. This was an attack on the consulate carried out by Al-Qaeda affiliates and first-string Al-Qaeda members that resulted in the death of the first ambassador in over 30 years. And the reason we can't have access to the witness statements of those who survived the Al-Qaeda attack is because this is a criminal matter. Using that theory, Congress could have been shut out investigating 9/11 itself. That is a stunning statement and should be rejected as a proper answer to a legitimate question in a bipartisan fashion. We cannot allow the FBI or this administration to deny the Congress access to vital information to tell the story of Benghazi because they consider this a criminal matter. I consider this a major national security failure that you could see coming, that no one's been held accountable for yet, and that to have accountability, you have to have information. Now, as to the witnesses themselves, we have been asking since March for them to be made available to the Congress, to the people who survived the attack. One person has been interviewed by the House after they subpoenaed that person. I got a statement, or a letter from the State Department that said we could not interview the survivors because we might, as Congress, jeopardize their safety and compromise our national security. But it was okay for the administration to interview these people. The only report that has had access to survivors is the Accountability Review Board, which was an internal review by the State Department judging its own actions. And in that accountability review process, they never interviewed the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. So from my point of view, this is unacceptable and must change. What the administration is doing is dangerous for representative democracy. There can never be effective oversight if this becomes an acceptable practice. So I'm going to block future nominations coming from the administration, not because I want to shut anything down, it's because I want to open something up that's important. I want to open up the truth about Benghazi. And here's why those FBI interviews are important. Within 48 hours, the FBI had access to the people who survived the attack. And I bet you if we could look at those interviews, there's no mention of a protest. I may be wrong, but we'll never know till we look at the interviews themselves. On the 14th of September, Jay Carney said, "We have no information to suggest that it was a pre-planned attack." After the 60 Minutes show Sunday, that just falls completely apart and is a statement that should be challenged. And if we can't challenge that statement, then we have lost our way as a nation, because it's important. John McCain and Lindsey Graham challenged the Bush administration statements about Abu Ghraib and Gitmo. And all of a sudden we're some kind of heroes. All I wanted was to find out what happened, because I don't like it when things go wrong that affect our reputation and our national security. So here we are, the shoe is on the other foot. And when the press secretary to the President of the United States says, we have no information to suggest that it was a pre-planned attack, 3 days after the attack, that statement does not withhold scrutiny. What did the 60 Minutes show tell us? That this was a pre-planned terrorist attack coordinated in a military fashion, and the people on the ground could see it coming and made numerous requests for security, and nobody answered their request. If, in fact, these witness statements taken 2 days after the attack and 1 day before this statement indicated it was a terrorist attack, not a protest, that puts in question that everything the administration told us for over 2 weeks. So I will be asking the administration to do 2 simple things. Provide access to the witnesses who lived through the attack and give us their statements they made to the FBI 2 days after the attack so we can find out what actually happened. How in the world can you go to the family or to the American people and say, we found out what happened in Benghazi, when somebody outside the administration has no ability to talk to the people who lived through it? That's not going to stand. The stonewalling, the delaying, and the deception are going to come to an end, and we're asking something that's reasonable, and we're demanding action, not because we're Republicans, but because the nation needs to know how these people died, what the administration actually knew, and were they misled by the administration 8 weeks before an election. And we need to know, why were the numerous requests for security denied? Who actually did the denial? And should something happen to those people who were in charge of providing security in Washington for Libya? Or is it okay that nobody ever gets fired after 4 Americans were killed in an attack by Al-Qaeda that the people in Libya have told the media, we saw it coming? With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Ayotte.
I believe we're going to.
I'm sorry?
No, go ahead. Okay.
First of all, I want to thank Senator Graham and everyone who is here on this very, very important issue. Let me just say up front, my interest in this came because my background is as a prosecutor as well. And when we looked at the statements that were made by the administration right after the attack, I think we all know now that those statements were not true. And essentially, when we looked at the issue of the talking points, why does it matter? Pull those talking points up again. There's absolutely no reference in those talking points to a video. Yet even almost a week after this occurred, we have a situation where not only Ambassador Rice, but the President of the United States is still referring to the fact that what happened, which was a terrorist attack on our consulate in Benghazi, was related to a demonstration over a heinous video. And the 60 Minutes report recently that came out made very clear that this was an Al-Qaeda attack from the beginning. We still have not gotten clarity why the references from Al-Qaeda were removed from the talking points. Why were these misrepresentations made to the American people around an election? And it matters because the American people deserve the truth on this. The victims of this terrorist attack, they deserve the truth. And so I want to commend my colleague, Senator Graham, for pursuing the witness statements, pursuing the ability to call the witnesses that were there at the scene, the survivors, who our hearts go out to. But we need to hear from them to understand the truth of this from the beginning and for the American people. And why have we not brought anyone to justice? It's been quite easily for the media, CNN, the New York Times, the London Times, to interview Abu Khatallah, who we know has been indicted for involvement in the attack on our consulate in Benghazi through a secret indictment, but that was reported in the media. Recently, we captured Al-Libi, a longtime member of al-Qaeda in Libya. So where have our law enforcement officials been in terms of capturing Khatallah, who seems to be spending his time at cafes, and allowing the media to talk to him, even though he has been charged with the involvement in the attack on our consulate? And others have been charged, although their names have not been revealed. Why has no one been brought to justice? I met with Director Comey of the FBI yesterday, and I asked him that. And frankly, I think he is a very good man who wants to get to the bottom of this. But it's just totally unacceptable that no one has been held accountable for the attacks on our consulate. And if you put it all together from the course of what it's been like to pull teeth from the Senate to get information about these attacks at each step in the process, in the context of where we find ourselves now, where we know at least one person who's been indicted and others are being allowed to just hang out in cafes in Libya without any accountability, it really makes you wonder what is going on here. The American people deserve the truth, and we will continue to pursue this to make sure that this never happens again, and that the security requests that weren't answered, why weren't they answered? And so this doesn't happen again. And that's why we're all here. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I'll turn it over to Representative Jason Chaffetz, who's done so much work on this, investigating it on behalf of the House.
Thank you. Appreciate being here. We seek truth, justice, and accountability. I simply want the President of the United States to live up to the promises that he made the few days after the election. Pull up those quotes, look at that video. He promised that as new information became available about Benghazi, he would release it to the public and he would disgorge any information that he had and make it available to the Congress. That has never happened, ever. At every single step of the way, this administration has put roadblocks on everything that we seek to find. We need to be able to see those documents shortly after those people were interviewed there in Germany. We also believe that we should be provided the other information that the administration is still slowly dripping to us. In the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, we literally got a document dump just a couple of weeks ago. Almost 1 year after the fact, the State Department is still giving us documents. So to say, as they have for months, that they've given us everything, they have not. It is absolutely and totally unacceptable for the Department of Defense to claim that there are no after-action reports regarding Benghazi. For those of you in the media, those of us in Congress, you need to know that those of us in Congress have been asking for the after-action reports. They claim there are none. And if there are some, they refuse to give them to us more than a year after the fact. We simply want to know the truth. We have 4 dead Americans. I like to compare it to what happened in Boston. Imagine in Boston, we had 4 people killed by terrorists. Imagine if to date, more than a year after what happened in Boston, if not a single survivor had ever been able to be interviewed and talked to in public. I have a list of people that I think the Congress and the American people should hear from. They need to hear from Secretary Clinton. They need to hear from Ambassador Susan Rice. We need to hear from Cheryl Mills. We need to hear from Michael Morrell. We need to hear from General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We need to hear from General Ham, who was in charge of AFRICOM. We need to hear from Vice Admiral Joe Leidig. We need to hear from Lieutenant Colonel Gibson so he can tell his story about how he was told he couldn't engage in the fight. And there are a whole host of people there from the CIA and other agencies that should be able to tell their story. But we are more than 1 year after this attack. And the American people and the United States Congress, in an open forum, have not yet heard from even a single person who was on the ground that night in Benghazi. That's wrong. But we will continue to doggedly pursue this until we get the truth, the justice, and the accountability. That's who we are as an American people. That's what I'm fighting for. I think that's what everybody up here is fighting for. Thank you.
Excuse me. Well, I want to thank Lindsey Graham and all of my colleagues here, but especially Lindsey Graham for his tenacity. I don't think we'd be having this gathering today if it were not for the people behind me who have stayed with this in light of extraordinary efforts on the part of the administration to sweep this issue under the rug. A little over a year ago, I was on a Sunday morning talk show, Face the Nation, and the attack on Benghazi on the consulate had just taken place, and I have very rarely been astounded. But before my appearance, Susan Rice, then ambassador to the United Nations, spoke and said, a spontaneous video has sparked this spontaneous demonstration that no one could have foreseen. And not only that, Al-Qaeda is decimated. It was probably the most remarkable performance I have ever observed in the many years that I have been on these shows. Immediately followed was the Libyan president of their legislative assembly, who said this was a terrorist attack, we know it for a fact, and that was that. And I, of course, couldn't help but agree with him. But the charade went on for weeks, and you cannot look at this issue without remembering it's in the context of a presidential campaign. The President of the United States, weeks later, after it was clear that a hateful video had nothing to do with it, spoke to the United Nations and spoke about hateful videos and talked about spontaneous demonstrations, as the ambassador to the UN and others continued to do so. And even to the point where at the second presidential debate, the Mitt Romney said, wait a minute, you never said that Benghazi was a terrorist attack. And incredibly, with the authentication of the so-called moderator, said, oh yes, he did say it was a terrorist attack in the Rose Garden. He did not. The President of the United States condemned terrorist attacks, but continued weeks later to call it a spontaneous demonstration sparked by a hateful video. The American people were deceived throughout the presidential campaign about the realities, and they're still being deceived about it. There's still been no interview with those survivors. There's still been, no one knows who did the talking points. Is still, why is it that weeks later, the President of the United States would continue to parrot this propaganda line that it was a spontaneous demonstration? Why is it that even in her last appearance before the Foreign Relations Committee, the Secretary of State, the presumed nominee for president in 2016, said, who cares? Well, our answer then and our answer now is we care, and the American people care, and the families of those 4 brave Americans who sacrificed their lives unnecessarily, they care. They care. And that's why we need a bipartisan, bicameral select committee to get to the bottom of this with subpoena power. I'm afraid that may be the only way that we will ever get justice and knowledge and information to the American people. The families of those Americans deserve it. The American people deserve it.
Let me just say this. The administration said they want to get to the truth. They want to get to the bottom of this. If that's the case, let us have access to the witness statements. Don't make us subpoena everyone that we want to bring in front of the committee to get their story and understand what took place. Think about this fact. 60 Minutes has talked to more people on the ground in Benghazi than I have. Laura Logan has interviewed more people on the ground in Benghazi when this happened than Trey Gowdy has talked to. I would argue probably anyone on the stage. There's something wrong when the administration says one thing, they want to get to the truth, and yet we don't get access to the very people. The first thing you do when something terrible happens is you talk to the people who were there. So give us a chance to do that. That's what we're all about here. And I'll be brief here and we'll get to your questions, but I just want to commend Senator Graham and the folks up here, but Senator Graham in particular, for saying, look, we're going to put a hold on things until we can get access to this information so that the American people can get to the truth. Pretty simple concept, pretty basic idea. That's what when the administration, I mean, this is just the way it works in this wonderful country. When something bad happens in the executive branch, you're supposed to have hearings in the legislative branch where you get to ask the tough questions, you get access to all the information so you can get to the truth. That's how the checks and balances of this wonderful system work, and right now it's being stymied by this administration. And so what the senator is doing, and these folks up here have been doing, is right on target, and again, I commend them for doing that.
Thank you, Jimmy. We will not waver in our commitment to see that justice is done for this terrible act in Benghazi. And make no mistake, justice will be done. That was the President of the United States over a year ago. We're investigating exactly what happened, but my biggest priority now is bringing those folks to justice. That was the President of the United States over a year ago. No one has been arrested. No one has been prosecuted. No one has been brought to justice. We don't even have access to the witnesses. You and the media were good enough for my 16 years as a prosecutor not to tell me how to do my job. And so far in Congress, y'all have been good enough not to tell me how to do my job. I'm not telling you how to do your job. But I'm going to ask you some questions, and if you can't answer these questions, then I'll leave you to draw whatever conclusion you want to draw about whether or not the media has provided sufficient oversight. Can you tell me why Chris Stevens was in Benghazi the night that he was killed? Do you know? Does it bother you whether or not you know why Chris Stevens was in Benghazi? Do you know why we were the last flag flying in Benghazi after the British had left and the Red Cross had been bombed? Do you know why requests for additional security were denied? Do you know why an ambassador asking for more security days and weeks before he was murdered and those requests went unheeded? Do you know the answer to why those requests went unheeded? Do you know why no assets were deployed during the siege? And I've heard the explanation, which defies logic, frankly, that we couldn't have gotten there in time, but you know they didn't know when it was going to end. So how can you possibly cite that as an excuse? Do you know whether the president called any of our allies and said, can you help? We have men under attack. Can you answer that? Do any of you know why Susan Rice was picked? The Secretary of State did not go. She says she doesn't like Sunday talk shows. That's the only media venue she does not like, if that's true. Why was Susan Rice on the 5 Sunday talk shows? Do you know the origin of this mythology that it was spawned as a spontaneous reaction to a video? Do you know where that started? Do you know how we got from no evidence of that to that being the official position of the administration? In conclusion, Congress is supposed to provide oversight. The voters are supposed to provide oversight. And you were supposed to provide oversight. That's why you have special liberties, and that's why you have special protections. I am not surprised that the President of the United States called this a phony scandal. I'm not surprised that Secretary Clinton asked, what difference does it make? I'm not even surprised that Jay Carney said Benghazi happened a long time ago. I'm just surprised at how many people bought it.
Questions?
Senator Graham, just to clarify, you said you would block future nominations. Does that apply to Janet Yellen?
Yes, ma'am.
Johnson?
Yes, ma'am. It's the only leverage we have. The only time the president's ever answered a question that Senator McCain and Ayotte and myself asked, and we've asked a lot, is did you ever contact anyone in Libya personally as president to provide assistance to our people under siege? And we were threatened to block Brennan as the CIA director, and they gave us a couple-line answer. No, the president never called anyone that night in Libya to see if the Libyans could provide help. Now, what am I asking for? A year, 14 months later, the people that were under attack, we don't have access to. The media has talked to more people, as Trey said, than we have. How can the Congress conclude an investigation if you don't have access to the people? So the reason I'm putting holes on these folks is to tell the administration, for the good of the country and for future oversight purposes, you can't hide behind a criminal investigation. That's not a good reason to deny the Congress witness statements 48 hours after the attack. And if that becomes the way we do business, just look how that would allow an administration in the times in which we live to shield itself from criticism about future national security failures. And I can assure you, Senator Clinton And Senator Obama, if this were the Bush administration, would be right where I am today.
Senator, just to follow up, you said that you haven't had access, but there has been a diplomatic agent who's been deposed by the House Oversight Committee.
Yeah, he was subpoenaed. He's,
He has been.
yes, yes, and here's my point. You shouldn't have to subpoena these people, but that's what we're down to. And they should be made of, Secretary Kerry, who's a good friend, said that I want to get Benghazi behind me. I want to answer every reasonable request and get this matter behind me. I don't want to be talking about Benghazi, on my watch. John, put yourself in our shoes. Okay, something bad goes on. You've got an ambassador killed for the first time in 33 years. You got a stream of security requests that are denied. You got the administration in power saying that it was a spontaneous event caused by video, and everybody on the ground says it was a terrorist attack. You got 60 Minutes now validating it not was just a terrorist attack. They know who planned it, and it was a long time coming. John, what would you do? Would you sit on the sidelines, my good friend, and have the Secretary of State tell you, I'm never going to let you talk to the people who were there, when you've had the chance to talk to them, and when the ARB had a chance to talk to them? And to President Obama, if you were a senator, and this was the Bush administration, and the FBI had taken interviews 2 days after the attack from the survivors, and the Congress wanted to look at them, and Bush said, no, it's a criminal matter, would you sit on the sidelines? Why are these interviews important? Jay Carney said on 14 September, 3 days after the attack, we have no information to suggest it was a pre-planned attack. Greg Hicks, who's the deputy, told Washington in real time there's a terrorist attack. He said that Chris Stevens' last communication was, we're under attack. There's not one piece of evidence coming out of Libya to suggest there was a protest outside the consulate. Not one.
And people don't bring mortars and RPGs to spontaneous demonstrations.
60 Minutes identified the people who planned the attack and actually how they did it. So I'm just asking my colleagues, would you accept this? What am I asking for? To talk to the people who were there so that we can close this chapter in a reasonable way. How can I go back to the families and say, well, Benghazi's behind us. What did you learn from the people who were there with my loved one when they died? I don't know. I never got to talk to them. You know, I've been a prosecutor and defense attorney. How can you close a case when you never talk to the witnesses? And this is a constitutional democracy. We pushed the Bush administration to tell us about the interrogation techniques. We signed on board with Democrats to make sure that we learned about what went wrong in Abu Ghraib and Gitmo. And now we're trying to find out what went wrong in Benghazi, and here's what we know. The story they told us about Benghazi was a flat-out deceptive story that doesn't withstand basic scrutiny, and a year later we can't even talk to the people who were there.
Senator Graham, Channel 9 Eyewitness News out of Charlotte. What would it take for you to allow the vote on Watt besides this Benghazi information?
Watt's in the system. I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about, they've already filed cloture. She asked the questions, people to come. Here's what it takes to do the right thing. I mean, is it too much? Allow not me, the appropriate committee to look at the witness statements from those who survived the attack 2 days after the attack to see if they said it was a protest. And here's the question for everybody. If the people 2 days after the attack who survived the attack never indicated there was a protest, how did the story start? If they're telling you it was a terrorist attack, how did their statements get washed away and it becomes something else? So that's what it would take for me, for the Fed chairman, for Homeland Security. Jay Johnson, I'm gonna vote for him eventually, because he's a really well qualified guy. But I don't know what to do other than this, and I'm just begging Secretary Kerry, John, please. We can do better than this. You cannot, in good conscience, deny the Congress the ability to talk to the people who survived this attack. We're not going to compromise national security. Did you compromise national security when you let them talk to the ARB? Do you think we're going to put them at risk? No. We're going to try to find out what they knew so we don't repeat this again.
Senator, what about concerns that, aside from the compromise of national security, that subpoenaing these witnesses, talking to them, might jeopardize future prosecutions? I know some folks have made
Okay, I'm a prosecutor. Anybody, Zero concern. We're trying to find out how our ambassador was murdered. This is a national security failure. Apply it to 9/11. What if the Bush administration said, we're not going to provide you access to those people who were in charge of preventing 9/11 and talking to those witnesses because we're looking at a criminal investigation here? You could literally, under this theory, stop the Congress from making inquiries Iran-Contra. I mean, just look at the number of times that the Congress has inquired about national security failures. But it would be breathtaking for us to accept this. We're not fighting a crime. This is not the mafia. This is a terrorist organization that's been designated by the Congress as a military threat to the United States. They killed our ambassador. So if we adopt this as the model, that any time Al-Qaeda is involved, we can't look at what happened because they may prosecute somebody, would just destroy oversight. Anybody?
Senator McCain, have you heard any, or Senator Graham, have you heard any response from the White House on your letter about Prime Minister Maliki and any assurance from the Maliki people that they have heard your request?
I met with Prime Minister Maliki just a short time ago. Frankly, he was not very happy about that letter. But I've known Lindsey Graham and Joe Lieberman, and I have known Prime Minister Maliki for 14 years. And I spoke very frankly with him that if he expects this kind of assistance that he's asking for, that we need a strategy and we need to know exactly how that's going to be employed, and we need to see some changes in Iraq. And that means an inclusion of Sunnis who are now more and more becoming alienated. And finally, I pointed out to him again, facts are stubborn things. The attacks and fatalities are higher than they've been since 2008. The situation is deteriorating and it's unraveling, and he's got to turn it around. And I would give him as his best model the Anbar Awakening. That means bringing the Sunni, particularly in Anbar, back into the political process.
Senator Graham,
I just want to add also something. Trey Gowdy, he was a federal prosecutor. I was a state prosecutor. If we're going to set a standard with regard to talking to these witnesses till the criminal prosecution is over, that's a minimum of 3 years if you put the appeal in. So we're going to wait 3 years when we've had a terrorist attack, which is very different than your average criminal case, as Senator Graham talked about, to get the truth and think about what we need to know to prevent future terrorist attacks. We have a responsibility here that extends to that. So that, to me, is not a position that is sustainable, and it's one that could put our nation at risk if that's the position this administration is going to take in all of these terrorist attack type situations, and particularly this one, in light of what we've talked about today.
Senator Graham.
Yeah, then we have to go 2 questions.
Senator Graham, administration officials tell CNN that both CIA and State Department officials have spoken to Congress. Why is that not enough? And the second question is, CNN is now reporting that there was an attempt to get Katala on the same weekend that we successfully grabbed al-Libi. Was it a mistake to go after al-Libi first?
You know, I don't want to second guess who we capture. I just know that it's pretty hard for the American people to swallow when the chief suspect has been interviewed by the London Times 4 days ago, the New York Times and CNN, and we can't capture the person. Now, they're arguing that to capture him would destabilize Libya. That's what somebody is reporting at CNN. All I can say is that the president made statements that Trey indicated right after this attack that was music to the American people's ears. We're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to hold those accountable. So to the administration, how do you explain the fact that the chief suspect has been interviewed by 3 international media organizations in the comfort of a hotel lobby or a hotel restaurant, and we can't capture the person our people have identified as being one of the chief suspects? I shouldn't be explaining that. The president should. I think the American people deserve an answer to that. We have not. This administration is not being honest. We have not talked to the people on the ground. Would they trust the Bush administration to tell them what happened in Abu Ghraib without interviewing the people in the jail? some of them who were facing court-martial. Would you suggest it's proper for the Congress to take the word of any administration when it comes to policing themselves and that be the end of the story? Simply put, why can't we talk to the people who were attacked and hear from them what happened in Benghazi? If that's too much for Congress to ask, God help us all. And this reluctance and unwillingness and refusal to allow the Congress to talk to the people who were on the ground during the attack will not stand. One last question.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say you want to talk to the survivors, is it not enough to just get the transcript from Congressman Chaffetz, or do you want to have a meeting with them through on a committee?
How can you judge credibility through a transcript?
Well,
Me personally, this is the question. No, this is not about Lindsey Graham. This is about the process. On the Judiciary Committee, we should be allowed to look at the FBI interviews because the FBI is under our jurisdiction. They should turn those interviews over to us, and we should be able to look at what people said about what happened 2 days after the attack. And why is that important? What if the survivors said to the FBI it was a terrorist attack and never mentioned a protest? Is it fair to me to say, well, you had witness statements 2 days after the attack that suggested a terrorist attack. How could Jay Carney a day later say there's no evidence of a pre-planned terrorist attack? That's just basic common sense oversight. But no, I don't have to talk to all the survivors. I just want the committees of appropriate jurisdiction to have a chance to independently interview the people who survived the attack. It's called oversight. Thank you all very much.